Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming out this morning on a rainy, chilly autumn day. This is the panel devoted to beauty and readability in translation. I'm Andrew Schelling, and this is Amelia Hall. We are colleagues at Naropa University. I think maybe the first thing we should do is both introduce ourselves a little bit in terms of the work we do and how we've gotten into this, and then we'll try to make a few brief provocative comments to try to open up some discussion about this vast realm of translation. So, as I said, we both teach at Naropa University. I'm here possibly under two false pretenses. I should say, first of all, I am not a translator from the Tibetan. I'm not a Tibetan scholar at all. I have worked with the Sanskrit language for about 40 years and translated primarily classical Sanskrit poetry and related poetries and other sort of vernaculars like Pali, some of the Prakrits, and a little bit of work with the medieval Hindi. And very little of it Buddhist-oriented, most of it secular Kavya. And I think the other false pretense, in a way, is that I'm not particularly recognized as a scholar, but I'm a poet. And translation is one of the things I do is integral to my poetry work, but I don't have the sort of rigor or credentials that probably most of you have. So I'll do the best I can, but coming from a somewhat different approach to poetry, which is as a practicing American poet.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, so my name is Amelia Hall. I'm assistant professor. Sorry, I gave myself a higher title. Just putting it out there. So I'm assistant professor at Naropa, and I teach reading Tibetan texts. I teach Buddhist philosophy. I teach introduction to Buddhism. I teach a lot of different topics. And my background, I started off translating namtas. I did both a namta for both my master's thesis and my doctoral thesis. And I now work on a couple of different types of Tibetan translation. I'm really interested in landscape, and so I've been translating a lot of Baal texts, a lot of texts talking about sacred lands and their characteristics, and also interested in the spirits of that land, so the Nagas and the Nyen and the Sadak. So these are tricky texts. There's a lot of cryptic language, there's a lot of cryptic words. I see it sort of like a puzzle, and I love puzzles. So this is a sort of background of the kind of things that I'm interested in translating, and also attempting to give in my translations some sense of the place that is being talked about. And I'll talk a little bit more about my criteria or what kinds of things that I try and bring to the translations to kind of take the reader there, to take the reader into that place. And that's what I'm mostly interested in at the moment. That's all.
Okay, good. The title of this breakout group is Beauty and Readability in Translation. These are obviously very difficult terms to wrestle down and get into a matchbox or something. I was thinking this morning that in our contemporary world, especially with increased recognition of cultural difference, beauty seems to be a very relativistic and quite subjective term. I don't think everybody's thought that way. You don't have to go back very far to John Keats saying, truth is beauty, beauty, truth. And I think if you got back into the ancient world, both in the West and in the East, beauty would be seen as objective, not subjective. So that was just a thought I had this morning. Readability is something different. Readability is tricky because, in terms of what Amelia was saying about cryptic texts, there may be texts that are not meant to be particularly readable, especially without having some kind of oral tradition along with them or an inner code that opens them up for you. So readability as a virtue in translation may not be, entirely what we're always looking for. I want to just make a few thoughts out about translation, since primarily this conference is talking about translation of poetic texts. How many of you know the definition of poetry given by the American poet Robert Frost? Anybody here?
No, I don't know.
Robert Frost said, "Poetry is what gets lost in translation." When you read that, you, as a translator, immediately hit a brick wall, which you can't stay at for very long, because if you're going to believe that the act of translation is possible, you have to move past that. But that would be an extreme view of both what poetry is and what translation is capable of, that whatever is translated, it may be ideas, it may be images, it may even be sound values, but it's not the poetry. I far prefer an alternative definition given by the Mexican poet Octavio Paz. He was a great man of letters and Nobel Prize winner for literature. Octavio Paz said, "Poetry is what gets translated." It's a very different view. Maybe you leave behind the ideas, you leave behind the imagery, you leave behind the sound values. I'm really using those sort of three particular categories because they've been standard in Western literary criticism. But you leave all that behind, but somehow the poetry comes across. I am much influenced by what's sometimes thought of as the first great essay on translation in sort of the British, European, British, American tradition by John Dryden. And he says, a good poet, we could say a good poem, is no more like itself in bad translation than a living man would be to a corpse. And I think, this is what I would really use as my criteria for both readability and beauty is, does the text come alive? Is there a spirit that has really moved over through this translation? And this has often baffled me because working with the Sanskrit language, so much of the old translations of poetry, particularly the ones done during the colonial period, are just execrable. I mean, they can be cartoon-like, they can be loaded with assumptions that we're at enough of a distance now to recognize that Sanskrit poetry did not have clunky end rhymes, it did not have absolutely predictable sort of iambic pentameters going through. There's even a, very respected Sanskrit scholar named Richard Gombrich, who in a very infantile introduction suggested that iambic pentameter is poetry for the English language, and did his translations of Bilhana into iambic pentameter, which gives a little swat to every other syllable and a heavy chiming or sort of clunk really to the end of each line. With these kinds of things in mind, I once asked the great Telugu scholar Velcheru Narayana Rao why the translations done by British colonialists of Sanskrit and other Indian languages were so bad. And he said, really tenderly, it's because they thought Sanskrit a dead language, so they translated it into dead English. I'm not sure that gets us any closer to beauty and readability, but I think the real question here is whether the language that you're bringing your work into is dead or alive, and how to work with that. I think there's really only one way to work with that, which is our own language that we speak on a daily basis is really about the only one that we can make come absolutely alive, which is why I would give an immediate urge to everybody to really familiarize themselves with current literature. I think somebody at the conversation last night said we don't read enough novels. Novels, poetry, all that would be very, very important. I have tended to use a Sanskrit word instead of something like beauty or readability, and this goes right to the question of liveness, but I like the sort of technical use that Sanskrit grammarians use of the term Shakti. Does a grammatical structure have the power to convey what you want to convey? And I think that in Sanskrit and many of the old Indian traditions, a great deal of the poetry is very small, contained lyrics, often 2 or 4 line stanzas that are meant to be self-contained. Even in great long poems, most of the stanzas are meant to stand on their own and each produce a certain rasa, which is to say that each of those stanzas has a particular Shakti. And what we want to do in translation is try to figure out a way to bring that Shakti across. And that's a struggle we're all going to have, but I think it can only be done by trusting in our own language. Let me give you just a quick example, which is that if you're trying to move between 2 languages, one of the first things you have to leave behind, it seems, is sound values. Not entirely. You can have little tricks that bring certain sounds across. Images can be tricky. There are images that are deeply embedded in a particular culture, and if you try to bring them into our own language, you either need lots of footnotes or lots of explanatory texts in there. But it's been a truism with linguists for quite a while that there are no deficient languages. That means that every language that has ever been encountered is capable of saying anything that needs to be said. Vocabulary may be an issue. So the French use the word weekend, for instance. They have no problem taking off Saturday and Sunday or understanding the idea of a weekend trip, but they just simply had to borrow the word from us. The Achumawi Indians of northeastern California turned out to be great at auto mechanics. They learned very quickly that the battery is the heart of an automobile, that the transmission is the hips of an automobile. It was quite easy to just bring that into their language. But if we're going to take as a kind of axiom that there are no deficient languages, that means that our American English or British English or whatever spoken Canadian English, any of these forms are completely adequate to bringing across even the most complex or abstract ideas. However, you're probably going to have to work with the genius of your own language and leave behind the genius of the original language. Quick example that I often run into, there are translators who think when you work with poetry you should try to reproduce the form of the original. This is quite known, say, from translations of haiku, where people like to use a sort of 5-7-5 syllabic structure, even though syllables from Japanese are very different than syllables in English. But a lot of the poems I translate will have 17 or 19 syllables in a line. That would be a sheer torment in American English, to make poetic lines of 19 syllables. I think very few of us would be capable of reading something like that. So the question for me would be, if something works effortlessly in the original but feels like a torment in the new language, is that true to the form, or is that actually just creating something dead rather than something living? Maybe our language needs to be much jazzier, We don't like iambic pentameters so much because as Americans we have been influenced by jazz music and a kind of street language that moves with a lot of syncopations and strange beats and quick lines and enormously unpredictable changes as we talk, as we sing our songs. And I think all of this is quite capable of bringing anything we want into our language, but at the level of Shakti, the level of the real energy and the real capability, we need it to feel effortless and powerful in our language. So I'm just going to
You're going to stop now?
stop now and let you pick up. Yeah.
What you've been talking a lot about, I mean, what I'm hearing from you is this idea of beauty and your sense of beauty. And some of what I was thinking about when I read the title for this breakout session, which was Criteria for Readability and Beauty, and I got kind of stuck on criteria because sort of like, are they trying to, I can't, I don't think there's any standard formula. I can't come up with a standard formula for the criteria for readability and beauty. What I can do is really actually sort of touch in with how I translate and what I'm trying to express with my translation, and different techniques and things that I keep in mind, which I hope create and so I hope has some kind of readability and beauty to it. And I want to start with actually the act itself of translation. And I don't know if anybody else does this, but I sort of have I almost create a sort of ritualized space when I translate. The first thing that I do is I can't look at anything on a screen. When I first translate something, I have to see it on the paper first, and I have to write it down. And there's something about the writing down that gives it a sense of I'm really engaging with whatever it is that I'm translating. And there's certain paper, there's certain pens, there's a certain place that I go in my home or in my office. There's a kind of a kind of space that feels good that I can touch in with that Shakti somehow, and I can't define it particularly, but there's places where it doesn't work, and then there's places where it does work. And I when I think about this, there was actually a Facebook post that Tsadra put out a couple of months ago. And it was something I don't actually remember what the point of the post was. It was about translation, obviously. But there was this picture, and it was a man lying in bed, bare-chested, with a cup of tea and a pen and paper. And I was like, yeah, that's it. That's the that's like being in that space where you can start to bring that out. So that's very important to me, actually, is to create that kind of space for a creative act, because for me translation is a creative act, and so setting up the space for that to happen, a kind of receptivity that I need in order for me to translate. Another very key piece is, and you touched on this too, that and Curtis was saying this last night, we don't read enough novels. I think we don't read enough prose, poetry, novels, certainly from the perspective of Tibetologists. And when I was studying, I forgot to read poetry. I didn't have time to read novels. I kind of was just really focused on whatever I was translating, and that was a mistake. So the importance of reading in your own language is something that I can't emphasize enough. The kind of things that you love to read, the things that you read as a child, the novels that moved you, the poems that make you cry. That's what I'm trying to do with my translation, is to move people, is to get them to feel whatever it is that I'm translating. So at the moment, what I'm working on a lot is these texts that are describing sacred landscapes. And there's various nature writers, people like Robert Macfarlane and Philip Marsden, and this wonderful, wonderful book by a woman called Okay. A wonderful book by a woman named Nan Shepherd, who wrote this book called The Living Mountain. It's a jewel of a book. And she was a school teacher and a poet. She lived in the Highlands of Scotland just at the end of the Second World War and walked up this mountain every day and wrote a book about her experience of going into the same mountain every day. And it's just beautiful. And she doesn't write as if she's up the mountain. She's not conquering the mountain. She's walking in the mountain through all seasons, through and encountering all different kinds of animals. And when I read that book, I think that's what I want my translation to be like. I want it to be like that. When I read that book and I can smell the grass, I can hear the sound of an eagle in the sky, I can actually experience being in that place. That's what I want to try and get in my translation. So it sort of seems obvious. You think, yeah, you should read your own language. But so many times when I talk to students and we're talking about translation, and I say, what books do you like to read? Who are your favorite poets? And sometimes they're kind of at a loss. They don't really, they're like, oh, well, I haven't really read a novel. I haven't read much poetry. And I think you've got to learn how to craft this translation and create your own style, whatever style you like. Keep reading. And the other part that I find very important also is consulting other translations, looking at how other people have done it. When I was translating the namtas that I was doing when I was a student, actually Janet Gyatso, Apparitions of Self, was one of the namtas I looked to see what you did. I looked at all the different ways that people have translated namtas to try and figure out, how do I translate this? How do I make this readable but also beautiful? I want this to be read by practitioners, and I want them to be inspired to practice, because that's actually the point of that story. It's not to just get all the facts down. That's not the point of a namtar at all. So reading other people's translations, reading what other people have done, looking at the choices that they make, all of these things. I mean, I feel like this is very pragmatic advice, and you're sort of off in the beauty realm, and I'm kind of like, well, what do we actually do? How do I actually do that? And these are some of the few things that I found really helpful, which is actually creating a space when you're translating, and you're bringing your whole body into it. You're bringing something into it, not just wherever, just sitting down somewhere, but that there's actually a kind of a sacredness to the space when you're doing that, and being inspired by poets, being inspired by writers, and checking out what other people are doing, and being critical about it. Do I like that? Do I not like that? Those are kind of practical things, which isn't really criteria, but it's more advice, I think. Which I think leads into a point that you wanted to make when we had this discussion of the choices that we make.
Yeah, maybe I'll make it, just give like a real concrete example from some translation I've been doing, well, more or less recently. The last project I worked on was a very likely 7th century, but the date's hard to know, Sanskrit poet named Bartra Hari, who was thought to be Buddhist by some, Vedanta by some. His work was edited in the late 1940s by a Marxist Indian named D.D. Kosambi, who did a marvelous job consulting something on the order of 400 different manuscripts. Even though he learned about 3,000 different manuscripts, he finally pulled this vast amount of material together and came up with what he thought was a real corpus for Bartra Hari, and then he included all the other poems that he found in a big critical edition that he did. Deep in that edition, far away from what he thought would be any original nucleus of Bartra Hari poems, which he counted at about 200, up around 700 something. He had an absolutely beautiful poem. No indication that it was necessarily written by Bartra Hari or not. But the poem opens with the words Re Chataka. Re Chataka Savadana Manasa Mitra Kshanam Api Shruyatam. Chataka is a bird. It's a quasi-mythical bird. It drinks only falling raindrops, only gets 2 or 3 as they come out of the sky at the time, sometimes equated with the what used to be called the Melanoleucus or the Cuculus menoleucus, the white and black cuckoo. So Re Chataka. Re is one of those words. It doesn't show up too often in Sanskrit, more in the drama, but it means something like woe is me, woe, or alas, alas. So here I was confronted with Re Chataka, which sounds gorgeous in the original. But imagine if you open an English poem, alas, alas, cuckoo. Or even worse, whoa, cuckoo bird or something.
Sounds like a bluegrass song.
It does. So what was I going to do with that? It was so gorgeous in the Sanskrit, and I even had a little sense if I could just bring just a slight bit of that sound value over into English. Re Chataka just, sort of haunted me for a while. But words like woe or alas or too bad or sob or something was just not going to make a poem work that way. And the cuckoo bird is a tricky one too, because if you just use the word cuckoo in English, it sounds, there's almost like so much punning and street level use of the word cuckoo that you almost can't get away with it in a serious poem. So I decided I'll have to stick with Chataka. That means a footnote. Luckily, Chataka shows up in a few other poems of Bartra Hari, and that gives me the question, should I footnote it the first time? Should I footnote it every time? Should I put it in the introduction so the text isn't bristling with footnotes? I'm not opposed to the occasional footnote, but the Re I really stuck on for a bit, and what the rest of his line means, Re Chataka Savadhana Manasa Mit Kshanam api shruyatam. It means let it be heard just for a moment with a single-pointed, attentive mind. Sob, O cuckoo, friend. So this is what I did with it, just to cut quickly, and it took me many weeks even to think how to approach this poem. And this is a very short poem. It's a little 4-line poem. And I ended up deciding that since what the poet was doing was trying to convey a message to this bird, this Chataka bird, this is an old Indian trope that you speak your heart's longing to some bird that's disrupted your sleep or chased away your dreams or something. Stay, Chataka bird, a moment. Heed my word closely. Many clouds course through the heavens. Not all are alike. Some freshen earth with chill rain, some merely thunder or rumor. The pain you hear in my voice, do not repeat it to anyone. So there I tried to keep the seriousness, which I could not have done if I'd gone with an alas or a woe or even a cuckoo. So stay, Chataka was the best I could do, and I love it as a secret trick that only another Sanskrit scholar would know, that I actually got the syllable count for 5 syllables and the kind of sound values for 5 syllables, and then I had to let it go and work with something else. And there are a few things in that poem that, I could be criticized as not really being in the poem because it has to do with the freshening quality of a chill rain in India. I assume many people here have been in India and know what it's like when you get to late May or early June and you start waiting for that rain to come to break the severe heat. And when the rains come, the whole earth freshens. That's something that, might not be known to somebody who lives in New York City, where it can rain all summer. Or if you lived in parts of the country where it was moist and you didn't have that contrast between the severe heat and then the sudden freshening rain that really wakes up the whole earth. So little things like that are very culturally determined feel to me like they should go into the poem without violating the spirit of the poem. So that's just an example of how I worked.
So similarly, a text that I'm working on at the moment, which is a naig to this Baal in Arunachal Pradesh, and it's the text is a conversation between Guru Rinpoche and Yeshe Sogyal, and Yeshe Sogyal is asking Guru Rinpoche about the land and asking him to describe the land, and the word used is sache. And sache has this meaning which you could translate it sort of like the formation or the way the land is formed, but that doesn't, for me, quite give the entirety of what sache means, because it's also the quality of the land, the actual quality of the landscape that is very pleasing and beautiful and has particular qualities. There's an arrangement that is it's got a sacred quality to it in this. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But it's got this.
Can we write it on the board?
Here, you write it.
There's several such. And then there's other ones too, right?
There's other ones too.
That means like geomancy?
Yes, like geomancy.
That's
Mm-hmm.
not this one.
It's the,
That's how you spell it?
yeah, the geomancy.
Okay, so
But
not
it's
that one.
but it is that one, but it's also using to describe. It's using that word to describe the geomancy of the land, but also the formation of the land. So that's why I'm having this. But this is a word that I wasn't sure that I could translate particularly, because it has all these kind of, the word itself has the geomancy of the land, but it's the arrangement of the land. It's all sorts of different things. So that was a choice that I made, to not translate that, but to have a footnote discussing what I think that word tries to encompass, rather than try and put it into one particular word. And so there's Guru Rinpoche, and he's describing this land and its qualities. And he replies, so Yeshe Sogyal asks him, what is this, can you describe this land? And he replies, as for this, it is called Wood Mountain. Cane, bamboo, 100 varieties of trees, 8 grasses grow there. At the confluence of various valleys is the palace of peaceful abode. A square formation of sandalwood trees grows at the palace of enrichment. At the great river, in the manner of the melodious sound of bell metal, is the palace of magnetizing power. In the midst of a triangle of stones at its base is the palace of subjugation. These palaces are endowed with the four enlightened activities of pacification, enrichment, magnetism, and subjugation. Everywhere atop the pinnacles of these palaces, drapes of white silk scarves are tied. The sides of the palaces are formed of blue silk that reflect like space. Underneath is a meadow of soft, springy turf, which is like the outstretched wing of a golden Garuda. Under that it is diffuse with black, fertile soil. Leopard and tiger cubs gambol and play. The outer perimeter is like an 8-petaled lotus, and it goes on and on and on. So he's describing this, and so the choice that I made was to not translate that term because I didn't think that it was just how's the land arranged. It didn't really encompass. He's describing its enlightened qualities. He's describing the four activities. He's describing how the land actually embodies the four activities. And so it didn't really seem that, for me, the choice I made was to not translate that particular word, but to have a footnote that explains all of the different meanings of that word and all of the ways that it can be understood. And also, I was trying to bring a sense of walking into that space, which for me was influenced by reading a lot of nature writers, of how they interact with the land itself. And so these are all things that these are all choices that I make that I put in the introduction, or I put in a footnote as some of the choices that I made with translation. And I wondered if I could ask you a question.
Absolutely.
About beauty.
Yeah, let's just open things up, sure. Yeah.
And then maybe open it up so we can
Yeah,
hear other people
good.
talking. But one of the things that we talked about when we were preparing for this was beauty. Is it always pretty? Is beauty always pretty and nice? And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that. I was thinking about a conversation I was having last night when I saw a mountain lion. I was talking with Janet, and I remember distinctly the smell of the mountain lion. It was going past an open window, and you asked me what was the smell.
I said, was it a good smell?
Was it a good smell or a bad smell? And I said, well, it was both, right?
Mhm.
It was kind of like ugh and ooh at the same time. You know, there was that kind of like, that's musky and intense and sort of like makes my nose wrinkle, but it's really intriguing and interesting and sexy. Yeah, yeah. So it was like, but it was beautiful, but it wasn't nice, you know. So, and then that kind of, that made me think about this question that we were talking about, what is beauty? And I wonder if you could respond to that.
Yeah, I think we agreed that we needed to, push things a little bit away from beauty as prettiness,
Yeah.
and that was where I was, much more interested in that sense of power. So in a way, a Shakti, what is the Shakti of the mountain lion that comes past you?
Yes.
And what is the power of that smell that comes through the window that's both alluring and also terrifying?
Yeah.
And, the sort of visceral reaction when your hair goes up on the back of your neck and you're confronted with an animal that turns you into a prey, possibly. But I think at the same time we can recognize that it's beautiful.
Yeah.
And sometimes the response to beauty is for the hair to stand up on the back of your neck.
Yeah.
Working with Sanskrit poetry, the interest tends to not be beauty, but tends to be rasa. And I know that there's a program tomorrow where there's going to be talk about rasa theory. But one of the reasons that the Sanskrit poets, even the most acutely spiritual of them, liked to write sexual love poetry was what interested them most was the body reaction. The inadvertent arousals that happen to a human being, and that told them that they were close to something very truthful and something very beautiful when that happens. But not just sexual arousal, also the arousal of fear, anger, humor, all the different kind of body responses and awakenings. So in a sense, now that we have these traditions available to us, I think something like rasa theory is more interesting and less kind of abstract in a way than rasa theory, and how you work with particular emotions, how you are able to evoke those emotions with a reader, and that I think is really beauty. You know, the great thing about thinking it through rasa is that almost all the powerful emotions can become sort of points of awakening or illumination that are not personal. So an example I like to give is when Macbeth has been killed and Lady Macbeth is having her hallucinogenic nightmares and trying to wipe the blood off of her hand, and you're watching the play and you're absolutely enwrapped by it. If this was a real murder, you'd be horrified. You'd call the police. You'd be fainting or something. But the fact that it's transformed by a work of art means that you're getting close to something, but where does that rasa exist? Is it Shakespeare's? No, he's been a heap of bones for 500 years. Is it in the book? The book is just a dead book sitting on the shelf when it's unopened. Is it in you? Well, that would be incredibly arrogant to think that the rasa belongs to you. So rasa theory believes, you know, that there is this sort of substratum of emotional truth and beauty, and the point of art is to awaken it. Even if it looks unlovely on the surface. Or smells confusing. Yeah. Can I ask an alarmingly specific question of Janet? What's the date of the Kavya Darshan you were talking about last night?
That's what, I'm a very bad person with dates, so it's the 7th century, I
Mhm.
believe.
I'm just
No,
wondering
I've
if
got Google right here, I think.
Yeah,
I
that's
don't
okay.
think- I don't think that we have an exact date, but I think we have a century.
I think that's the best guess.
Yeah. Because I think some of those poems you were showing, those are really probably Bartra Hari poems that come out of it. You know, most of these critics pick up poems from the
You
tradition.
mean that Dundon was citing the Bartra Hari? I don't think so, I doubt that.
I-
It wouldn't be, so my guy is Igal Bronner, I don't know if
Yeah.
you know him, who's a young generation
Mhm.
guy who really is trying to translate Sanskrit in a very beautiful way, and so
Mhm.
those were his translations. He knows Bartra Hari really well, and he's a Dundon
Uh-huh.
scholar, so he would have said that. It could be similar to Bartra Hari.
Yeah.
They're connected, but how much Dundon even knows Bartra Hari, I think is an issue.
He apparently mentions him somewhere, but also there is that, you
But
know,
not
that
very much,
particular,
yeah.
that particular sort of, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this, and I've wasted my whole life.
Right.
It's very Bartra Hari.
I see, okay, yeah.
And- well, let's open it up to some questions. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or thoughts or responses?
We've spoken a lot, so we'd like you to.
So when you were suggesting that we should use the language used in daily life in our translations, I thought this is good, but I'm also worried because I feel like I use language in my translations that might sound a bit dated. But then when you read your Bartra Hari poem, the translation of it, you use this phrase, course through the heavens, which, you know, maybe sounds like not quite of this century. So I'm just wondering, could you talk us through that your choice in using that phrase? And I think it balances beautifully in the poem as a whole. Like, you know, the whole poem sounds like something we can understand very easily, again, using language of our daily life today. But there's that phrase that sounds a little bit more dated. And I just wonder if you could talk about that, and if you think there's maybe like a degree to which you might use those somewhat more formal or dated phrases.
Yeah, that's probably a product of my overeducation. But, you know, taking your question seriously, I think there are ways to reawaken some of these older phrases, or even to use them that demonstrates like a sense of the history of our own language, so that these things still exist and are still alive and alert. So when I was making fun of the possibility of using words like alas or woe is me or something, that's because those things you just feel like you sort of can't get away from. But a phrase like course through the heavens feels to me like it's still there, available to us to be reawakened. And it may not be something I would say at the corner bar, but I may very well bring it up in a room full of, you know, modestly educated people who are familiar with poetry with the sense that all our language echoes the past. And a secret joy I often get with translation, but also with my own poetry, is to echo the past, and this has been a long tradition, especially, well known, I think, for Chinese and Japanese poets, and I think also something that you can train yourself to start to see with Indian poets very much, where certain phrases have a proven utility to them that keeps them awake and alive, even if they sound slightly old-fashioned. I did have a professor once, long time ago, he's long dead now, who did some translation work with Sanskrit. I remember at one point him saying, when I was translating Kalidasa, I wanted a language that was somewhere between William Butler Yeats and Wallace Stevens. And I walked out of the room, just my head spinning, thinking, that's just alarming to me, that you would actually sort of pinpoint a historical era and a type of language. I think it works better, especially with old material. Allow old material to feel old in your poem, because Bartra Hari has old material in his poems, and I think all poets do. So does that help a little bit?
Don't be shy.
Okay, maybe I go first.
Yeah.
I think I do not need.
No?
That scared me.
Can I put the stand right there?
No, that's fine. Thank
We're
you.
coming close to beauty for scary.
The Gendon Shemper, the Tibetan scholar, wrote a couple poems in English. One titled Malarepa, other titled Repo. And I don't know how good that poem is in English. And he admitted that it's very hard for him to write in English. I think he writes in English. And also what I'm thinking is, translate a poem in another language versus writing a poem in another language. Is there any difference? What do you say in that? Yeah, and another question is, you translate from Sanskrit, right? So there is translation of Buddha Charita, which was translated in the 13th century into Tibetan too. So I'm comparing the translations of Tibetan and English. So when there's a stanza using Shab Alankara, no, right? So I think the king is maybe his Sanskrit term maybe Raja or something. And Tibetan, you use the Shabda Ankara, we apply the whatever original, the sound, bring into Tibetan. And I think English translator also try to do that. So we called lion in Tibetan, Rida Jebo, right? The king, and then he tried to do king of a beast or something. Is that a poetic sound? King of beast.
Sure, king of the jungle.
Yeah.
So my question is, how you translate these kind of terms, Shabda Alankara, what other term you use, other terms, Shabda Alankara, into English in your experience? I think two questions.
Yeah, different texts I would work differently with. Poetry is trickiest because I think in poetry you really want a reading experience that's not interrupted by footnotes and various things. I do tend to try to put cultural information like that as much as possible into things like an introduction or an afterword or notes at the back of the book or something. But you're absolutely right, there's an awful lot of, sort of culturally embedded material in any language that is hard to know exactly how to work with, and I think every translator has to work it out for yourself. Some texts, it doesn't matter if they bristle with footnotes or have extensive introductions. Other texts, work tricky, it's trickier that way. And I've certainly taken the liberties with Sanskrit poetry to remove certain things that feel too culturally specific to really bring across without a big explanation. Other times I have worked to do a little bit of kind of explaining inside the poem that I am making, so that I don't have to have a footnote. And sometimes I resort to the footnote. And I do try to stay away from things that will sound just either absurd or sort of cliched in English. Which isn't to say I shy away from things that sound weird or odd. You know, what I just want to make sure is that the poem maintains a certain dignity, an effortlessness of that is there in the original poem. So, you know, I think, and then the question about translating into a language that is yours or isn't yours. I used to be a very kind of hard and fast believer that you could only really well translate into your own language, but I think we're sort of getting more sophisticated in recognizing what is our own language, where does it come from, who does it belong to, and some of the greatest American poets and translators have grown up not speaking English. William Carlos Williams grew up speaking Spanish, Louis Zukofsky grew up speaking Yiddish, and these are, you know, sort of iconic poets for the 20th century. Williams doing remarkable translations from languages that he knew, from languages he didn't know, working with other scholars or poets. So I think there's many, many ways to work, and I don't think there's any particular dogma that I would attach to it. But going back to your question about these very specific words, I've used glossaries. This manuscript I just did of Bartra Hari, one of the things that I was aware of is that he used very often specific plants. He had herbs, he had flowers, he had kinds of timber, he had leaves that may or may not be known to most Indians, but would, fit the Indian subcontinent. And some of them were, very practical and specific. Sort of a trifolate leaf that is thought of as a kind of emblem of the Trinity of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, and most Indians would recognize that, most Americans wouldn't. Or the Kadamba tree, which is an emblem for Krishna, things like that. So I put a botanical index at the back with a note in the introduction saying I thought these plants would be unknown to most North Americans, and I felt like I didn't want to clutter up the poems with explanations, but it would allow somebody to go back and see what is the gular fig, what is it doing in this, what does the Kadamba tree look like, and what may be its emblematic use, what is the Mandara tree, which shows up in both Tibet and India as a kind of plant in the Sukhavati heaven. Is that germinal to the poem? I don't really know, but I wanted to put it back in the index so that I could just use the original name of the plant. So this is where a lot of the oddity comes in my translations. Will be using certain Indian terms that, I don't want to try to just like make up an oak or a maple or a, wild mustard or something for the plant that's being used. And it was really plants with Bartra Hari. I could see with other poets it might be a more large natural history index. I've seen even, for instance, a Kalidasa index of animals and birds in Kalidasa. There's also one for Shakespeare. I mean, these are the kinds of things that, you have to make decisions, and then you also have to make decisions how well known is the poet. I'm not going to worry about Shakespeare. There's 1,000 commentaries on Shakespeare, but Bartra Hari, there's not very much in English, or Amaru, or, there's a few things for Kalidasa, but you got to go to India to find them, and that sort of thing. So these are very, individualized decisions.
I wanted to just respond quickly to, because you're talking about Gindan Chopa writing in English, and you said, how do we know if it's good, looking around, is it good? And I think for me, this also brings up the point, how important it is to understand the colloquialism, how important colloquial Tibetan is for me, so that I when I translate, I'm not. I'm making sure that I understand actually what is trying to be expressed. It might have a colloquial meaning. That a direct translation might end up being something kind of silly. I'm thinking about my teacher Lama Tachin Rinpoche telling a story. A friend of his was writing, I think you know the story, writing a love letter to an American woman, and he asked Rinpoche to read it over to make sure the English was okay, and it started with "Dear bee shit" instead of "Dear honey." Because he had got this word and he translated it that way, and that was not his intention with that love poem that he was writing. So it was just that it just brings up that if you I think also if you can tell a joke in another language, you've got a mastery of a language. If you can spot humor, that's something really for me, especially reading through namtas. In the beginning, I remember reading things in the Tibetan and thinking, I think he's joking here. I think he's being sarcastic, but I'm not sure. I have to go and ask someone who's Tibetan, is he being sarcastic? And yeah, he's being sarcastic. There's humor, and that's taken a long time for me to spot. So, yeah.
Just one thing to add to the conversation. One of the interesting things I think sometimes is when you're speaking with someone who's speaking in a language that's not their original language. So our experience, for example, English speakers with Tibetans who, some Tibetans have really good English and then it goes all along on a spectrum. But at least I personally love the way Tibetan people, especially those who are not completely fluent in English, but it's really their second language, the way they speak English, that there's a way in which some of the syntax, some of the choice of vocabulary, just the way it's put together, even though it's in English, it has a kind of Tibetan feeling, which is an interesting intermediate space where it sort of gets to your question that even though someone's speaking a different language, they still have the kind of spirit and all sorts of different decisions that they made kind of conveys something else, and sometimes that's very valuable. I've never seen those poems of Gindan Trimpel in English. Do you have them?
Yeah. I think the posted one right
Oh, okay.
fourth issue, the head is dire, I think
How many are there? Are there a lot? What?
4 and something, 4 or 5.
You can detect the influence of romantic poets, romantic poets there. That's how I felt, how I read it.
I'll also point out that there are a lot of different Englishes, and Gendon Chopo was probably speaking in Indian English as opposed to American English, and that has, really a lot of different feel to it. And I'll also like to point out that there are a lot of Americans who speak very good English and a lot who speak very poor English, and no.
Even to that point about how foreigners speak English. Like, for example, when French people speak English, I love it. It's just there's something so fantastic in it.
So what is it like for the Tibetans to hear us speaking Tibetan? What kind of, they probably don't love it. But yeah, that's another question. Is like, what do we bring when we speak Tibetan? Maybe there's some charming.
Gindan said, right, in that statement, he actually specifically said that you need the flavor, you need to understand colloquial village talk in order to really understand, like an English poem. He said, I can understand all the words, but I don't get the real spirit or whatever it is. So he said.
And one really good example that has frustrated me for a long time is Rabindranath Tagore. Tagore translated most of his poems and plays and things into English, and they are, I read somewhere, a critic who called them execrable, and I think that is means like bullshit.
Explain your choice of that word, Andrew.
No.
Yeah, excrement.
It's, yeah, yeah. But he must have been reading a lot of, not very good examples of pre-Raphaelite British poetry and the King James Version of the Bible. I mean, there's no reason for a 20th century Bengali to have used thee and thou repeatedly through his poems. And everything I understand about his Bengali poetry and song is that it's absolutely the greatest from one of the great, states or provinces of Bengal, and I feel so distant from it because I've never found, a decent translation. But then I have to remember that none of my Indian friends have read it in Bengali either. They're Marathi or Hindi speakers or something, and they, have to approach it through translation themselves. So I think he'd be a good example of somebody who is really dependent for his reputation on translation. And then behind translation, there's got to be this mystical aura that comes out of Bengal, because he could have never received the Nobel Prize based on his English version of Gitanjali. That, felt like it was about 100 years out of date when it appeared. And so I'd be curious about Gendon Chopal, whether he was, falling in with some of these Bengali Renaissance people who had these outmoded English models, or if he was picking up much more street level, colloquial English. So I'd love to see these English poems. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I can't tell.
Yeah. Yeah.
Follow up on Gunnar
Yeah.
question about the ornaments of sound. So, say for example, say in the Sanskrit verse you have a lot of ksha sounds repeatedly in the same verse, and there's a lot of kind of conflict and violence, and it's kind of conveyed through that sound. What would you do in English? Because we don't necessarily even have much ksha sounds in English, right? But would you try to create some kind of sound effect, or would you consider that as a possibility? Do you think that can be carried over, and is that an important part of the poetry to somehow convey in translation?
I personally would not for a whole poem. I will, like with the Stay Stay Chadaka from Ray Ray Chadaka. That's about as far as I'll go. I have found more likely the original sound suggests something in English to me that I might not have thought of. And so I'll get something that comes close to an original sound there, but not in a sustained poem-long way, really at the level of individual words or individual phrases. I just think that really of all the, I would say the three principal classic categories our poems have: sound, melopoeia, images, phanopoeia, and thinking, logopoeia. And I think it's the sound, or the melopoeia, that is the hardest to bring between languages. And Sanskrit and English are both Indo-European, but if those of you who have studied any of it know that there are a lot of sounds the Indian ear absolutely hears, like aspirations, which are unnoted in English. We hear them, we use them, but we don't recognize them, in the sense that if somebody does or doesn't aspirate a B, we still know what the word means. It doesn't throw us off. Dental versus palatal, T's and D's, that sort of thing. So we're working with really different sound systems, and I would consider it a intriguing algebraic exercise to try to bring across a sound pattern, but I wouldn't consider it poetry. Yeah.
I can project. You can leave the microphone there. It's actually for recording. Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. So a couple of people have mentioned the importance of reading novels, of reading poetry to being good translators, but I'm also intrigued about the practice of writing poetry, and you in particular call yourself a practicing poet. And I certainly would not call myself that. I wouldn't be able to just compose a poem in English, and so I think that negatively affects my ability to translate poetry from the Tibetan. And so I'm interested in thinking about the possibility of sort of partnerships. We know a lot of the texts in Sanskrit to Tibetan were translated in partnerships, and working with somebody who's sort of more knowledgeable about the Tibetan side of things, but then also possibly getting somebody who's a practicing poet. I know this was done by Jason Protas, who does Chinese monastic poetry for a recent dissertation of his, and so I'd be interested to know if anyone, not just the two of you, have done that, have tried to do that, or what we might think about that possibility.
So when I was translating my Namtar, which I did for my doctoral thesis, there's poetry, there's revelatory poetry, I call it, in that, and there's sort of poetry verses going back and forth between people, and that was really a very challenging part of my translation. And I worked with a Tibetan writer who was a poet who had translated poetry, Shakespeare, all sorts of things into Tibetan, but was a established Tibetan poet. And that was, I mean, that made such a difference. As soon as he read through my translation and chuckled a little bit at some of my choices, reading through that again with his insight and his understanding was very important. On the English side, because I like to write poetry, I also like to read, so it's both of those things. I felt fairly confident that I could then take that and make it into poetry that would be readable for an English reader. But it was actually having somebody who understood the Tibetan, who had experience of poetry and wrote poetry themselves in Tibetan, that was incredibly helpful. Yeah.
I think it's a great idea of scholars and poets collaborating. I think some of the really finest translations, and it may be less important for Tibetan, I don't know, but I know that there's so many languages from India, and what reward would most American writers have to learn Bengali or Marathi or Kashmiri or Gujarati, or let alone Telugu or Tamil or but I'll point out one book. I think, probably, in my mind, speaking of beauty, the most absolutely beautiful translation book from an Indian language is a little volume by Edward Dimmock and Denise Levertov called Speaking of Krishna. And I don't know how they work together. I haven't studied it. It doesn't show up in Denise Levertov's biographies. It just says that they did it. I don't know if they even ever met, but Dimmock was the scholar and Levertov somehow managed to accomplish these poems that I think are as beautiful or more beautiful than anything that's been brought from any of the Indian languages into English. And that had to do just with Denise's fine, poetic ability, and whether they worked from sort of pony translations, whether they sat down together, I don't know, but I think it's an extremely fruitful way of working.
Anyone else?
I have a question about cliches that appear in Naic type literature. And so following up on your statements about flora, I think in your translation you say it's like an 8-petaled lotus.
Yes.
I mean, from my point of view, that's such a cliche, and I'm wondering, whether it's the task of an English translator to express what that means to a Tibetan in more fluent idiomatic English. So that's a question I have. And then, I really liked how you began with so much practical advice. And something I've learned over the years is to always consult the Poetry Foundation app. Because I do this, I think, poetry of, waterfall of youth. Youth, what is youth in English? How have other people expressed it? And so they have a lot of metadata for all their poems. Nancy maybe uses it too. And so you can search on different subjects, water, flowers, youth, and then, you go to other poems written in English that describe it, and you can find all kinds of good imagery and synonyms. But at any rate, so I guess my question, not to put you on the spot, but it's like an 8-petaled lotus.
Yeah.
What does that mean in English? And why the choice to translate it literally and not find an equivalent in English that somehow will call to mind an image that the reader, can formulate and be moved by.
Yeah, thank you. There's something that I actually hadn't thought about when I translated that, because it just said 8-petaled lotus, and I appreciate you bringing that up, because I hadn't actually really thought about it. It was just kind of, that's what it says, so I'm going to keep going. So you've given me some ideas about what I might do with that translation that I'm currently working on. I think that I would again probably build into some kind of explanation about what it is that you're in the center of a lotus, that you're actually looking at the peaks of the mountain. And I know this place. So I've stood in this landscape and I've looked around and I've seen the 8 peaks of a mountain, and I feel like when you're in that space, I feel like I'm standing in the middle of a lotus. I don't know if I can on the spot come up with how exactly I might change the translation of that. I'd have to think about it some more. But I really appreciate you bringing that up, because, again, this is what's great about collaboration and having people give feedback. Because I hadn't actually thought about that being so much of a cliche, but you're absolutely right. It's sort of there, and what does that even mean? So, and
it also invokes, those of us who are in the Tibetan Buddhist world have seen so many paintings of so many Buddhists sit on a lotus. So the idea of being in the center of a lotus with a certain number of petals is such a familiar thing.
It's sort of, I kind of took it for granted.
Yeah, I personally would have kept the literal translation in that case too, because I think, that's really invoking a kind of very familiar image of being on a lotus, being surrounded by, and then the footnote might have to.
I just want to ask Jan,
Yes.
how are you going to?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's
Sure.
Because I think you have to live it as, I personally think you have to live it as it is, because it's got so many cultural significances. You say Namkolo Tigtil Salama Natu, it goes together, it's auspicious signs. I think if you try to find an equivalent in English, then you totally lose that.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
of course we will need footnoting within that.
Yes.
Maybe what Gasset says, a good translation, sometimes that needs to be introduced, but I don't know how you can find the equivalence of that for that.
Sure.
Like, Sakamandabji is so Tibetan that
Yes.
it becomes, I think, impossible to
Sure.
substitute it.
Yes.
Yeah, and you don't
Well-
want to become quirky with your translations.
No.
In other words, like if many translators and readers are familiar with the 8-petal lotus, you could, consult a botany book and come up with an octafoliate, something or other. But you are going to, sideline yourself into sort of, an eccentric room in a way, sit at the table by yourself, and there's a real reason for, particularly, I think with religious texts, especially if there's technical language, that translators agree on certain standard translations for certain words or phrases, so that you don't read several different texts without even being aware that you're talking about the same territory. You may think you're in 3 or 4 different landscapes, and it's very, very useful for that.
Amelia's case especially, so you say Sasha,
yes.
but you have to keep it.
You have
Because
yeah.
Sakamandabji is one of the most important marks of land. Namkolo Tigtil Sakamandabji
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So especially when it happened, we're talking about descriptive landscapes and sacred landscapes,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's essential.
Yeah, I'm just to follow up on that. The description that's being given here is very specific to practitioners. So there's particular visualizations that are being. It's a sadhana. It's actually information for a practitioner to practice in that landscape, and so everything has a symbolism. It's very symbolic. So yeah.
There's been a translation process from the actual landscape into the formalized imagery of the sadhana already.
Yeah.
So that's, so then you probably want to stay there and try to
It's a visualization practice. I mean, it's you know, and the palaces that aren't really there, but you're visualizing that because you're practicing in that space. So you want to be in the middle of a lotus, I think.
But then that raises the issue, you know, is this poetry? Is the original even poetry, right? If it's so overdetermined by what I'll call cliche, and I mean that with lowercase c, I don't mean that in a pejorative, but if it's so overdetermined by that, so, you know, it may be the case that there's 8 mountain peaks there, but, you know, they use 8-petaled lotus for other places that don't exactly have 8 lotuses, because the point is not to reflect exactly what the actual geography is, but to train the reader and the seer, the pilgrim, to see the place at a higher level as a abode, heavenly abode. So I guess then my question is, if it's a naik that, you know, is that poetry? And so then if it's not, it can be translated literally.
Poetry?
I guess because I was saying it's so overdetermined by what is, you know, you're supposed to see. He was saying it's sapche, it's really important to say that there's, you know, the center of the lotus and the leaves and the petals and all of that. I guess I'm saying, so it's a personal aesthetic preference that there's certain types of literature where you know what you're going to expect. You know what you're going to find. And it all just sort of appears. There's not that much creative, And so then I guess I was assuming that you take liberties and maybe deviate a little bit from the standard utterances and think, well, maybe it's not the sapche that's so important to the reader, but to express that the landscape is, it's alive, that the shapes are important, it's highly textured, and that a flower is a good analogy. And just do it that way. But
then I
that
think
deviates
you-
from the
you
tradition,
really
and then
are
you're
gonna
no
lose
longer
your- I
in a
think
naik.
you
Yeah,
lose
so I grant that
yeah.
for sure. So I'm thinking more in terms of then just a proper stanza, not a naik, but a poem, a nyangak. If you saw 8-petaled lotus, would you still translate it literally, or maybe say something else? But it's totally context dependent.
But I think, I mean, I'm not, I wasn't translating this necessarily as poetry. I think there's poetic aspects to it. But in terms of what's the point of this text? The point is a guide for a tantric pilgrim. And so there's instructions there that are very specific in terms of what you visualize and what you do in that space. There are some portions of it that need to be translated very clearly because it is a sadhana. You're actually practicing this. So to go too poetic in this context, I have to be very careful, because then I'm kind of turning it into, you know, just a lovely description of the landscape, but there's very key parts of that relate to the practitioner in that space. And so trying to keep that balance without also, but I don't want it to sound really stilted. I mean, this particular naig has instructions for practice within that space. It also has detailed instructions of how to reveal terma that's buried in that space. And it has things like take 5 steps to the left and dig down, but then there's kinds of other practices, esoteric practices that have to be done in that space. So it's this mixture of very, very specifically describing the landscape and its features, as well as being a practitioner within it. So those are all those things, and I don't know if I necessarily think about it as poetry. So it's I mean, I really appreciate your question, because it's bringing up how much do I want to, the kind of outer meaning of this text, which is this beautiful landscape that's a pragmatic refuge for people. And then for a tantric pilgrim, it has this whole other layer of inner and secret meaning to it. And that if I deviate too much, I'm not producing the sort of inner and secret meanings that are sort of code for practitioners. Does that make sense?
Absolutely,
yeah.
yes. No, I just wasn't taking that seriously enough early on. And your earthy language is fantastic. I really like
Thanks.
the word turf.
Turf.
Yeah, was it damp turf?
It's springy, soft,
turf, yeah,
springy
that was
turf and
fantastic,
black
yeah.
soil.
And so once you went there, then I thought, oh no, I want to just hear more of this language.
Yeah.
But it's just a personal aesthetic
Yeah.
preference.
Yeah. No, but it's interesting.
It's okay.
I just suggest that in terms of cliche, I know you're not saying that in a way at all, but cliche is, I think it's Christopher Rick.
It's what?
Christopher Rick, it's like a literary critic.
Oh, because we're
Wrote on cliche,
Yeah.
how important cliche is actually, how it has the ability to revive and reawaken images and force of poetry. So I think it is important. I think we maybe, when we use a cliche, we need to put it in maybe in a kind of a reawakening context or something. But then I think in terms of if you read English, maybe I'm really crafted in Tibetan, but when you read eight petal lotus, why are Tibetans saying it's 8 petals? Why are they saying counting the petals? And suddenly the petals come in your eyes.
Yeah.
You say lotus, okay, lotus. You have an image. But 8 petals, suddenly it just makes you focus on the petals. So why are they saying that? And suddenly it makes you kind of draws your attention to an aspect of the lotus, of an object being described in a different way. So I think cliches are not cliches in a way. Sometimes.
Yeah.
Sure.
And do we have to stop soon? It's 10:30.
Yeah, 10:30 is technically. Thank you.
Yeah. I work on Naic literature as well, and so I'm really interested in this question. And how do you take this kind of standard, often sort of formulaic language, but also convey to the reader of English that these texts are sort of sadhana-like in nature. They're drawing the reader in. They're sort of inviting them to visualize the landscape around them. And so I was thinking about this particular example, and in particular what Professor Gyatso was saying about connection to art historical images of people seated in the middle of lotuses. And so maybe conveying the sense that the text is working on the reader, trying to get them to imagine something and to say, instead of like an 8-petaled lotus, but like you're sitting in the middle of an 8-petaled lotus, you know, sort of drawing the reader kind of in and making it clear that this isn't just some third-person description of the landscape, but it's something that you is being done to you and that you kind of have to do to the landscape as well.
So in this particular case, it's Guru Rinpoche talking to Yeshe Sogyo. And she's asked a specific question about the land itself, the qualities of the land, the way it's arranged, the geomancy of it. And he's giving instruction on this very kind of esoteric description of the land. And again, so it's sort of, how much would I be adding if I'm saying, he's saying to her, you're sitting in the middle of this? I don't know. I mean, I would have to think about that choice.
Yeah, it's like the freshening of the rain example
Yeah.
earlier.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you're adding it, but kind of bringing out the
Yeah.
text.
Yeah, and it's the choices, because I mean with this it was I started off the translation, it felt very stilted, and I wanted it to be this conversation between these two figures, and I want it to it's not necessarily poetry, but I want it to be really beautiful, and I want people to feel like they're in that place, which is why I did things like springy turf and the leopard cubs gambling and playing around. But then there's specific things that I'm not sure if it's sort of transitioning really smoothly. And so, yeah, this is choices that I need to really think about.
You know, I think there used to be a sense everywhere that poetry transported you. Maybe you didn't know where it was taking you, but, you know, we could even say at the emotional level, it's taking you into certain emotional states. I think, you know, spiritual texts are remarkable that way because their purpose is really to transport you. And in that sense, these things really probably are poetry as opposed to just verse. You know, there's something you can think of with many cultures, especially oral cultures, is that there's poetry and then there's verse. In India, you know, mathematic texts are in verse, linguistics is in verse, history texts, whatever, and I wouldn't call those poetry. But I think anything that's really meant to, you know, I mean, it was Archibald MacLeish who said a poem should not mean but be. but also is it possible for that poem to put you into a state of being, a state of existence, as opposed to meaning something? And that's why I would always argue for trying to find your way past these cliches. Is there a way in which the reader actually sits up and recognizes something as opposed to sort of falling asleep because it's such a familiar phrase? Yeah.
Okay.
Last question, or?
No, you.
Yeah.
I have a lot of stuff to say.
You finally settled on Chataka. It is Chataka, isn't it? The
Yeah.
bird. Was it because no other bird fitted that diet of raindrops? I was wondering whether nightingale, which in English poetry evokes the beauty of the song, inspires the listener.
Sure, and I've
Could have
tried
worked.
that in the past, but the Chataka is really, a cuckoo bird. And cuckoo, not only has a funny connotation in English, but also so many of our folk songs are full of cuckoos, not warbling till the 4th day of July and that sort of thing. It's got a whole other cultural quality. And so I think sometimes keeping in place, the flora and fauna that are actually there. One of the hardest ones say, how do you translate clothing, for instance? When the so for instance, all the dictionaries will give Mekhala in Sanskrit as girdle. I've got a friend named Mekhala, and I don't really want to call her girdle, we've got these sort of mismatches there, and you have to do the best you can, with these words. And sometimes I feel like my readers, if they want to read this, let them know what a Chataka bird is. I don't want to mislead them and give them even we Americans only know nightingales primarily from British poetry. So, but these are individual questions, and I think it's less about having precise answers than that you make these decisions. That's part of the excitement of translation. You confront these things and you have to, make decisions for yourself, and then hopefully tell your reader a little bit what to expect.
It feels like we're stopping. I have a lot to say, so it would take too much time.
But I want to hear what you have to say.
What was I gonna say? Okay, I was just going to answer Nancy's question in a different way. When I translated the life story of Jigme Lingpa, so one of the things that I try to do when I'm translating is, in the first phase, is get it as literally as possible. Capture all the metaphors in particular, like not to translate the metaphors that are in the, literal terms, which is sometimes really hard to get that all out there. And then once you spewed out the very, very little translation, then start to work on it. In my case, I had a friend who was a practicing poet and, who didn't know Tibetan literature at all, went over the whole text and helped me to polish it. In my own opinion, so he helped a lot to make it better, but I felt like we didn't go far enough. When I look at that work now, I feel like we could have polished it. We could have made it much better in terms of its literary kind of qualities. And one of the things that I do find is that once you really understand what the line is saying and all the things that it's doing on its own, the more you tinker with it, the better. And you can sort of look over it many times, and then you keep sort of dropping out stuff that doesn't have to be there, that's really a kind of artifact of the precise grammatical, is this an instrumental and stuff like that. I find that the more I do that, the better and better that a translation becomes. Of course, there's only so far you can go, and some of the changes you don't want to make, and so on. But I do feel in the case of that particular work that I could have gone through it one more time, and so it's just like a process that your own ear can polish something in a certain way. It's really an art. It really is an art. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's a creative crafting.
Okay.